Almost 2 years after the poorly named War of 1812, the territory of Indiana became a state in 1816. In a decade, the population of Indiana went from 25,000 to roughly 150,000. The Native American population outside the Miami and Potawatomi reservations were remnants of larger bands who have been removed again and again. Many were gradually moving west years before Indian removal became policy. Lush forests became fields of crops, and vast marshlands began to drain to be converted to farmland. The frontier that was once called the Old Northwest was rapidly fading. In 1823, a small band of natives of mixed tribal origin, said to be both Seneca and Shawnee, moved into the area of Madison County, Indiana, near present-day Pendleton, which is northeast of Indianapolis. It wasn't uncommon for native parties from Ohio to set up hunting camps in Indiana for the winter. This group consisted of 3 men, whom the local settlers knew as Logan, Ludlow, and Madole. Accompanying them were 3 women and 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. They didn't create any problems for their white neighbors, so the settlers didn't mind their presence too much, but not everyone was comfortable with having natives living so close by. Many still remembered the days of Tecumseh's Confederacy and incidents like the Pigeon Roost Massacre. The settlers in the area were mostly small farmers with a few rugged frontiersmen, traders, and trappers. Nearly 600 families occupied Madison County. On March 19, 1824, some settlers gathered to help raise a house for a newcomer in the area. Among them was Thomas Harper, James Hudson, Andrew Sawyer, John T. Bridge, and his 2 sons, James and John Bridge Jr. While there, they took part in a common frontier pastime, binge drinking. As they got liquored up, one of them mentioned the presence of an Indian camp in the area. Thomas Harper, who despised the natives, didn't have many nice things to say about them. He boasted how he would kill any Indians who dared mess with him. Both Harper and James Hudson were said to have had relatives killed by the Indians during or before the War of 1812. A couple days later, Andrew Sawyer reported 2 of his horses were missing. He gathered his son Stephen and a few of the neighbors, which were Hudson, the Bridges, and Thomas Harper, along with a young man named Andrew Jones. And they set out on a rainy Sunday afternoon to search for the missing horses. Harper realized he had the perfect excuse for dealing with the native camp. He convinced Sawyer that the natives were likely involved and needed to be dealt with. His plan was to rob and kill everyone at the camp, and if anybody asked about it, well, it was just a bit of frontier justice. After all, who's going to care about a few dead Indians after decades of conflict? On March 22nd, Harper and the others set their plan in motion. They approached the native camp near Deer Lick Creek, and 2 of the men, Ludlow and Logan, were at the camp, while the third, Madole, was out tending to his traps. Sawyer and Hudson mentioned to them that a couple of their horses went missing and they could use the help. Both the natives agreed to help and were paid 50 cents each, which wasn't bad money back then. John Bridge Jr. wasn't feeling good about the whole thing and asked if he could go home. His father and Thomas Harper scolded the 17-year-old, calling him a coward, and not just any coward, but one in the eyes of God. Apparently they forgot about the whole "thou shalt not murder" commandment. Bridge Jr. collapsed under their pressure and tagged along. Bridge Jr.'s brother, James, was sent home for whatever reason, possibly for being too young. The party stopped at an empty cabin and had a few more drinks. Afterwards, they were divided into 2 groups. Ludlow went with Harper, Sawyer, and John T. Bridge Sr., while Logan accompanied James Hudson, Andrew Jones, and Bridge Jr. As the men moved along through the woods, they fell back, lifted their rifles, and fired. 2 of the rifles failed to discharge. Hudson was the only one successful in striking the poor soul. Logan was still alive and begged the men to shoot him in the head. Hudson passed a knife to Bridge Jr. and told him to finish the job. He then stabbed Logan twice in the chest. The 3 men dragged his body into a shallow grave and buried him. In the other group, it was Thomas Harper who shot Ludlow in the back while the others stood by. Afterwards, they met up and made their way to the native camp to kill the rest. James Hudson drew the line at murdering women and children and chose to stay outside the camp. Harper, Sawyer, and Bridge Sr. entered the camp and murdered 3 women and 4 children. The women were shot and beaten to death. The children watched in horror and begged for their lives. Their pleas were ignored. They were stabbed and beaten. Andrew Sawyer noticed one of the boys still alive crawling away. He grabbed the boy by his legs and smashed his head against a log. The third Indian man, Madole, returned to the camp as the murders were taking place. The killer shot at him, possibly hitting him, and he escaped into the woods and was never found. The bodies of the women and children were stripped of their clothes and mutilated. The men dumped their bodies into a shallow pond, looted the camp of all its valuables, and left. At the Bridge cabin, a neighbor boy named John Adams was staying the night with James Bridge. When Bridge Sr. and Jr. came home, he overheard them whispering about the murders. When he was sent home the next day, he told his father Abraham what he had heard. A few of the neighbors reported gunshots from the direction of the Indian camp and decided to investigate. Abraham Adams and a few others, including John Bridge Sr., who is feigning innocence, arrived at the camp and discovered the grisly murder scene. The ground was stained with blood and human brain matter. They discovered one woman, who was still alive, crawling from the pile of corpses. She tried to communicate in broken English, but the men couldn't understand. Bridge Sr. insisted that she be put out of her misery, which made Abraham more suspicious. They left the poor woman there in the camp naked, exposed to the elements, and reported the murders to the community. County Coroner Charles Tharp requested the dying woman be cared for at the nearest cabin, which was the home of Peter Jones, father of Andrew Jones. They didn't want anything to do with the woman. The next closest cabin was, unfortunately, that of John T. Bridges, and thus the dying Indian woman was taken straight into the lion's den. She laid in Bridges' cabin, drifting in and out of consciousness, and she did not survive until the next day. It is suspected that Bridge Sr. killed her to keep her from talking. However, the word had already spread throughout the community, and everyone knew who the killers were. A militia of 22 men was organized, and they made their move to apprehend the killers. John Bridge Sr. attempted to escape but was quickly captured. Thomas Harper, the mastermind of the murders, took off with the loot. A militiaman named Moses Cox took aim at the fleeing Harper and fired, but missed. Harper disappeared into Ohio and was never captured. Andrew Sawyer, James Hudson, John T. Bridge Sr., and his son John Bridge Jr. were sent in chains to a hastily built, single-room log cabin jailhouse. The miners involved, Stephen Sawyer and Andrew Jones, would become state witnesses. News of the crime soon reached Indian agent John Johnston in Piqua, Ohio. Realizing the potential crisis, Johnston made keeping the peace with the local tribes his top priority. The last thing everybody wanted was another native uprising. In order to maintain peace and fully earn the trust of the natives, the prisoners must receive a maximum sentence. Johnston and his friend William Connor traveled throughout the region and counseled with the chiefs, assuring them that the white man's justice, while slow, was effective. The Fall Creek victims' belongings were returned to their families and received compensation from the agency. The killers were indicted on April 8, 1824. Their trials were set for October, mostly due to Judge William Wick catching an illness, much to John Johnston's disappointment. He wasn't sure how long he could keep the natives waiting. Some of the best attorneys in the region were hired to defend the four men, like Calvin Fletcher and Martin Ray. Both would become prominent politicians in Indiana's early days. Johnston managed to hire United States Senator James Noble to be the lead prosecutor. Noble had a particular talent for persuading juries. Finally, in October, James Hudson was the first to be tried, with Andrew Jones being a key witness. Much to the surprise of many, especially the natives, James Hudson was sentenced to hang by the neck until death. After a scathing sentencing remark from Judge Wick, Hudson was removed from the courtroom. For the first time under U.S. law, a white man was sentenced to death for killing a Native American. Hudson appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court but got nowhere. In November 1824, he escaped from jail and was on the run for about 10 days. When he was found, he was dehydrated and his feet were frostbitten. On January 12, 1825, in front of a large crowd of both settlers and natives, James Hudson was hung by the neck. His body hung for about 30 minutes, then was interred at a nearby cemetery. The trials for the other men began on May 9, 1825. Andrew Sawyer was initially only convicted of manslaughter, but later was retried and sentenced to death for murder. John T. Bridge Sr. and his son were also given death sentences. The jury did feel sympathetic towards Bridge Jr. and could see that his remorse was genuine. The locals started a petition to get him pardoned. On June 3rd, the three men were brought to a makeshift gallows. Another large crowd gathered to watch the hanging. Many Seneca and Shawnee returned to see justice finally served. Andrew Sawyer was the first to hang. He didn't die immediately and began groaning while the sheriff quickly lifted his body up and dropped him again. He stopped moving after that. Next was John Bridge Sr., who died instantly. And finally, the now 18-year-old John Bridge Jr. The noose was around his neck, and the hood was about to cover his head, and just before he was dropped, a rider made his way through the crowd. It was the new state governor, James Brown Ray, holding a pardon in his hand. He gave it to the young man and said, "Go, sir, and sin no more." When Bridge Jr. was released, he fainted. The bodies hung there for about 35 minutes, and the crowd dispersed. Though justice did fall short with the escape of Thomas Harper, the Seneca chiefs were satisfied. Much to John Johnston's relief, there was no retaliation. This was the last violent incident between settlers and natives in Indiana. And though this was an historical trial and a rare recognition of human rights of indigenous people, it didn't really leave much of a precedent. The massacre was largely forgotten outside of Madison County, Indiana, and Native Americans continued to face unequal justice for years to come. Incidents like Fall Creek Massacre pretty much sealed the deal when it came to the Indian Removal Act. As mentioned before, the ringleader, Thomas Harper, was never caught. He was seen in Ohio, Virginia, and some say he made it as far as Texas. Beyond that, his name is lost to history. John Bridge Jr. seemed to have taken the governor's advice to heart and, by all accounts, did not throw away his second chance at life. For a while, he worked on his grandfather's farm in Ohio, then moved back to Indiana. He spent the rest of his days in Carroll County, Indiana, working as a dry goods merchant. Few in the community knew of his dark past, and knew him to be a loving husband and father to his children. He is buried near Delphi, Indiana. That's all for this video. Feel free to like and subscribe for more Frontier lore, and take care.